In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Or I'm not even pretending. I'm just actually drunk at 9 a.m. in California. Okay, so
living your best life.
I'm glad this is not live. So hey everybody, welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head. This is Max Golding, and we also have Harriet Fraud, of course, and we also have a special guest. For our first recorded guest on the podcast is Pete Bourgelais. Pete, did I say it correctly?
Yes, you did. Hi, everybody. It's great to be on the podcast.
So the topic of today's episode is going to be mental health in rural America, otherwise known as the country, the place that we often don't talk about when we're talking about society in general in the U.S. and politics in general, and certainly not mental health. It's sort of left out of the picture. So Pete had reached out to us. He was a fan of the podcast, and he happens to be running for some sort of office. Pete, you can elaborate on the details of the district and the seat and everything.
Sure. Yeah. I am a candidate for Maine House of Representatives in District 112, which is 17 towns and unorganized territories in sort of the western end of the state, like mostly western corner. And to give you an idea of how rural this is, I said unorganized territories, which is our term for areas that are so sparsely populated, they can't even really support a municipal government. You know, any of the usual services that we associate with your local government, they outsource it to the county government.
That's hard for me to wrap my head around.
Before we talk about mental health in rural America, I would like to give a definition of mental health so we know about what we're talking about, because it's such an amorphous term, people may not know. What mental health is, according to Harriet Fraud, is it's all about connection. The first, it's like a table with 4 sturdy legs. One leg is intimate connection, someone to whom you're very close. It could be a sex partner, it could be a best friend, it could be a relative. It has to be somebody to whom you really can open your heart. A second is a closer group of friends who you might call on sometimes in case you need it, but with whom you don't have an ongoing close connection. A third is a larger group, a group of people with whom you share a mission, even if it's a kind of casual mission, like being on the same job, joining a PTA, joining a blood drive, working on a political event together or a political party. And the fourth is feeling a connection to the economics, politics, and state of your city, county, state, national, and international world, so that you are connected, because mental health is about connection, and all 4 legs are important. And after that definition, Max and I wanted to ask you, Pete, what is the concept of mental health that you encounter in rural Maine?
So I think the best way to come at an answer to this question, I think, is, if I may, like by way of talking about the recent economic history of rural Maine, because I think a lot of this could also be applicable to other parts of rural America as well. And B, I feel like some of that background is a little bit necessary to understand the broader mental health trends at play there. And I can see in my head the connections to the exact sort of circles of community that you just described. So Maine, like a lot of northeastern states, used to have a significant manufacturing-based economy. And then after World War II, starting in the 50s, 60s-ish, a lot of those manufacturing jobs were sent into non-union workplaces in the South before they were just completely outsourced out of the country entirely to China. And so, starting in the 50s and 60s, the state tried to transition from a manufacturing-based economy to a service-based economy. a lot of your listeners have probably heard the slogan "Vacation Land" or "Maine, the way life should be," which is just, a decades-long marketing campaign to market ourselves as the place people can go on vacation. And that has been kind of an unequal economic transition because it tends to benefit the places that, excuse me, this is not COVID, don't worry about it. It tends to benefit the places that already had some name, or they had like some location that already lent itself to a tourist trap. And so, the jobs landscape that results from that is usually just in one of three categories. If we're talking about my neck of the woods, it's the military industrial complex. Like just yesterday, I was out picketing with some strikers at Bath Iron Works, which is owned by General Dynamics. Extractive industries like timber or gravel pits, about the only industry that exists here in my hometown of Phillips, aside from timber, is gravel pits. And hospitality, tourism type stuff. And so when you have an economy that has that type of shape, the kinds of connections that you, warts and all, can get in the cities do fall apart over the years, in that if you are between the ages of 18 and 50, once you've, graduated from high school, you have a lot of very strong economic incentives to move away because there are basically no good jobs here. And so that is assuming, of course, that you don't have some sort of substance abuse or mental health issue that keeps you here, or a lack of funds that keeps you here, or connections. And so, like, as a millennial myself, for example, like, you look at the census demographics of towns like Phillips and Carrabassett Valley, and they're in the 40s or 50s. And yeah, I don't mean this to disparage anybody here, but it does feel like you live in a giant retirement home. And it's very easy to feel disconnected from your own immediate community. And in a way, thank God for the internet, because that's some way to meet some other people who have some of the same interests in pop culture, for example, preferences as you. But you do feel pretty lonely pretty quickly. And, there's an awful lot of substance abuse in this area. It tends to be more alcoholism, I think, than painkillers and opioids, which, when you think substance abuse in rural America, that tends to make the headlines a lot more. But, with alcohol, it's just a trip down to your local supermarket to pick up a 12-pack of beer, as opposed to whatever rigmarole you have to do in order to get OxyContin without a prescription. I honestly don't know, because I haven't done it.
Part of what we've been talking about on this podcast so far is the interconnections between economy and politics and mental health. And so you also were saying in the beginning that the outsourcing of jobs, union jobs, manufacturing jobs, has taken a hit, at least where you live, and that's probably indicative of a larger pattern throughout rural America, which, if you don't have a dignified, like, decent wage job, the notion that your economic security where you live, for maybe not permanently, but at least for a long time, if that's not in place, that causes a lot of anxiety. It can kind of tug at your sense of hope and motivation and meaning and everything. So, I'm kind of hearing what you're saying is that they're all kind of interconnected.
Right. And this also, like, ties into a lot of issues of, like, aging with dignity. That's a very marketing type of phrase, but it's the one that comes to mind. Because Social Security just simply has not kept up with the cost of living for a long time now. And so most of the seniors, a lot of the seniors that I know, they have some sort of side gig that they do in order to supplement their Social Security check. For example, there's a woman in her 80s that comes to the local farmer's market and brings, like, this huge spread of baked goods and makes, like, $200 every day that we're open, which is, like, a large percentage of our revenues. But she needs that in order to supplement her Social Security. And, she can do that, but I I would not believe for a second that every 80-year-old in Phillips can do something like that. And then sort of adding to the economic-based sense of insecurity is the fact that, like, we do have some people who do, like, elder care for some of the older folks around here. And part of the problem is they're getting old themselves. And so it's creating this problem where, like, you know, the elderly people are, you know, slowly losing somebody to take care of them in their old age. And at the same, because the people who would take care of them are getting too old to take care of them in the first place. And there's also another, like, aspect of this, which is that at a population density as low as a place like Phillips, we don't really have small businesses to do a lot of the basic services that would be taken care of by a small business in a city. Like, there's usually a guy, or who could be of any gender, but let's just say they're guy in the general sense, who plows out your driveway in the winter, which is a huge thing because Maine winters are nothing to joke about. We have a guy who can drop off a cord of wood or two for the winter for your wood stove. We have a guy for carpentry work. But those guys are getting old too. And when the guy, you know, ages out, you have to find a new one, and that new one might charge more for his services. And so the cost of living goes up that way. And again, if you're on a fixed income, that gets tougher and tougher.
Well, you're talking about the problems of aging across the board.
Yeah.
And the problems of not enough employment or hope to root people in the communities in which they were raised. The sense of being in a dying region must communicate itself as a kind of fear of no future.
Right. It's like, and you know, I think for a lot of people around here, there is this sort of feeling that life and society has kind of passed you by in a way, because you end up living here in this house that, you know, could have any number of repair issues or whatever, but, you know, maybe your grandkids visit every once in a while. They certainly visit virtually now rather than in person, thanks to the coronavirus pandemic. But, you know, you were talking about the, like, last aspect of mental health, which is, like, connections to your community, to your state, to your county. It can be hard to feel those connections when you're just, it almost feels, when, I don't want to say it feels like you're waiting around to die. I think some people might think that when they're at their worst. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that thought comes up in some people's minds. And another thing about, like, part of the problems of things like elder care and basic services being a little harder to come by because the people who do them are aging. There's also, you know, in the midst of all of this, you know, stuff I've said about substance abuse and lack of jobs, there are some folks, maybe they're of retirement age, maybe they're a little younger, who will put in the time and effort to do things for the community. They'll, you know, serve on local nonprofit boards, things like the library or the community center. They'll help get grant applications put together for, you know, public works and such. Or the rural broadband effort, for example, that's going on out here, which is, I think, absolutely vital to revitalizing the community. But their population is steadily declining too. You know, they either get old to keep doing that stuff, or they may, like, suffer pneumonia in the middle of a Maine winter, which can be extremely debilitating, and move to warmer climates.
Well, how would you describe this within the rubric of mental health? Because it sounds like people are isolated.
Yeah, it's because the people who do things around here, I kind of put that in air quotes, just sort of a general class of people, the more they decline and the more they end up kind of just fading away, that eats away at a connection to your immediate community that a lot of people, you know, gain some, that's like an important part of some people's mental health. Let's see, I'm trying to think of a concrete example of this sort of thing. The library, for example, is a huge deal here in Phillips because, you know, it's kind of a makeshift daycare. a lot of people will park in its parking lot just so they can use the Wi-Fi because they don't really have high-speed internet at home. I think the library connection here is probably something like 3 times as fast as the one that we're recording on right now. And there are, public access computers there that people can use. It's, useful as a community center for things like the local knitting circle and stuff. And, my mother, who is in her early 70s right now, had to come in, and she doesn't have a whole lot of time on her hands because she's already busy with a bunch of other things, including running the farmers market, to fill in for the treasurer of that board because he was in his 90s and he was just getting to the age where he couldn't keep up with the bookkeeping. Because it's an aging and depopulating area, that community connection is getting slowly eroded away.
This is reminding me of a documentary I saw a while back called Greenhorns. Have either of you guys heard of it? Mm-hmm. About like young farmers. So there's a bit of a crisis in America in terms of, we have, I think most agriculture at this point is like big agribusiness, like
yes,
monocropping, like Monsanto, it just, the whole, like the machine controlling it. It used to be smaller organic, like family farms, obviously, with mainly the aging population of like old farmers either retiring or passing away, farming jobs not being like A, attractive, and B, they're not like, you can't really make a lot of money off of it anymore unless you sell your land and your business to a big agribusiness company. So this documentary, Greenhorns, was talking about a new surge. It's not an enormous surge, but of younger folks getting really tired of office jobs and the gig economy and, the precariousness of employment and saying, well, screw it. I'm just going to go farm. It's a really small movement, but I thought it was kind of exciting. But the issue, it's reminding me of this because also, Pete, maybe you could speak to agricultural sector in Maine. But that question of like, is the aging population and the lack of popularity in farming and wanting to just, grow healthy organic produce and whatnot, or engaging in like, stuff that I'm into, like permaculture, is there any kind of like hopefulness or a shift in that regard? Are there more resources needed for that, more education, or is it a non-issue? Am I just characterizing Maine in this way, like not knowing that maybe farming is not like a thing there?
We have an excellent organic farming advocacy organization in the Maine. Why am I blanking on the acronym? I have like 6 of their t-shirts. Maine Organic Farmers and Growers Association, MOFGA, that's what it is. I actually happen to be a certified permaculture designer, and I got my PDC from... Too. Yep. And I got my PDC certification from a program that was held at the Maine MOFGA campus in Unity, which is actually quite a drive from here. Phillips is in kind of an unfortunate space with regards to agriculture as it is traditionally practiced. That's an important caveat, because we are like in the very, mountainous northern Appalachia part of the Appalachia. So we don't have a whole lot of just flat fields that you can grow lots of corn or wheat or standard staple grains in. So it does lend itself to the kind of, I don't want to say niche agriculture, but the kind of unorthodox approach to agriculture that approaches like permaculture advocate for. And so, like, for example, I've been implementing some permaculture design components here at my place in Phillips for a couple of years now. So you've got the initial barrier of attracting people who are capable of thinking far enough outside the box to think about a permaculture approach. So that's barrier number one. And then, that sort of depends on, organizations like MOFGA being able to have a large reach. And, I've looked at their different maps of like farms that work with them and stuff, and it tends to be concentrated in the southern, more coastal part of the state. And that comes back to our economic history, where southern Maine generally benefited more from the transition to a service economy than northwestern Maine did. There's a certain amount of what I guess social scientists
call... By the way...
Yep. What?
Before you proceed, it would be good to help our listeners by defining what permaculture is, in case some don't know.
Right. And we have a bit of a problem here, as Max knows, that if you try to if you ask 100 people to define permaculture, you'll get 150 answers.
Yeah,
so
true.
help me out a little bit here, Max. But I think a good definition of permaculture could be it's a system of design thinking, usually applied to agriculture or housing, but it's in theory applicable to any area of human endeavor, that's about working with nature and using natural processes to create a positive relationship between people and the environment that they live in. And it's based on the ethics of earth care, which means you should improve the environment around you and the wildlife and plants. People care, which means that permaculture designs should benefit the person or persons affected by them economically, socially, physically. And return of surplus, which means different things depending on your politics, but it means that the surpluses you create through your permaculture designs should be put towards the first two ethical imperatives. Does that work for you, Max?
Yeah, that's a lot better than what I was going to say. I was just going to say it's just think of all the like cool hippy dippy organic agriculture, organic farming stuff that you like, and just imagine that it's part of a more holistic design system and mentality that people use. And also, I always like to just point out too that most of it is, I guess this is a harsh way of saying it, but most of it is kind of stolen from indigenous practices that were around for thousands of years that white people in Australia essentially got excited about and then sort of manualized to teach around the world, which isn't a bad thing. It's just usually the credit goes to like Bill Mollison and Jeff Lawton, these like. So anyway, if anybody's curious, just look up permaculture, and I think it's essentially it's a set of design principles of like how it usually has to do with growing food and the land. But like Pete said, there is a lot of emphasis in the people aspect as well.
Well, the people stuff is what our audience is really concerned about, because when we think about mental health, and we consider it as a set of connections, from intimate connections to group connections to the connection with the world, how does Maine's aging and isolation affect people's mental health at the moment in rural Maine, which would generalize to other rural communities that have been denuded of its young people because the rural America has been has been outsourced. Our industries have been outsourced for greater profit, and people have been abandoned. So I wondered, how do people sustain their mental health, and how does permaculture fit into that sustenance?
I think, one of the possible promises of permaculture is that it could create, sustainable food systems that aren't, completely organized around maximizing profit for shareholders. The whole ethic of return of surplus, and, like I kind of hinted at, there are different interpretations of that people like to push, but just the sense that, like, what you should do and the surpluses you create should be in some way given back towards the care of the people around you. Things like selling at local farmers markets rather than, I'm going to supply potatoes to McDonald's, as is the case with, say, the large potato farms up in Aroostook County in the far north of Maine. There's a chance that it can, I think, properly practiced, begin to revitalize the community. But I think permaculture is such a new idea in Maine that we're a ways away from building any of the kind of large-scale permaculture projects that exist in places where it's been around for a longer time, like Australia. Or the Bay Area, I imagine.
I was thinking about, how do people prevent loneliness then in rural Maine?
Booze and internet. And I'm not trying to be facetious. It really does kind of come back to, issues of substance abuse and a lot of like the distractions and such that people have in rural Maine. I mean, and elsewhere in America. We do have like some community organizations around here. Like there is a community center that organizes concerts and plays and such. We do have the library where there are occasional talks. We do have we do have a functioning town government here in Phillips, and there are things like planning board meetings. I'm the chair of the planning board, budget committee, an annual town meeting, board of selectmen meetings. The board of selectmen, it should be called the board of select people, but it usually is board of selectmen, is like the equivalent of a city council without a mayor. So, just 3 people who are basically serve the functions of a mayor. And, we do have the farmers market, which is a huge deal during the growing season.
Is AA and our usually 12-step programs are an intimate, powerful way that people can connect. Are they flourishing even in the smaller town of Phillips? Do you have an AA meeting?
Not in the smaller town of Phillips. As I recall, there is an AA program in Farmington, which is basically the town where people go to get most things that you can't get at the small grocery store. So things like prescriptions and such. And that kind of runs into another problem, which is like, if you don't have a set of wheels, or if your set of wheels is not very reliable, you're in serious trouble, and you start to like really drop out of the community in a way.
So I was going to ask about first I wanted to name where I live and places I've lived most of my entire life. There are what we call neighborhoods, in urban or suburban kinds of environments where there's tons and tons of people, block for block for block, hundreds of people. But in my experience, most of those people, and almost everywhere I've lived, don't talk to each other. They don't know each other. And that sort of super atomized, fragmented, alienated trend, if for anyone listening that's a fan of Marx, and I feel like he's, prophetically sort of said capitalism was going to push society further and further in that direction, or, maybe it's something else that's done that. But, I don't know most of my neighbors. I don't think most of my neighbors know each other. But we're all right there, right? We could be talking to each other, and I think improving our collective mental health in that way. I've heard there's a stereotype I've heard sometimes that in more rural small towns, everybody knows each other and everything. But if you're saying that there are, it doesn't necessarily work that way. There are opportunities for more connections through, farmers market, the library, these smaller organizations. But it sounds like because the scale is so small compared to probably what Harriet and I and a lot of our listeners are used to, that it's just a different, I almost wonder if we need to conceptualize it differently. If are people more used to a little bit more physical distance and maybe a little bit less connection due to the vast distances between each other? Am I thinking of it incorrectly?
I think you might be right about that. It's true that very generally speaking, we don't have the blocks and blocks of people who don't at least know the name of the person at the next door. I'm trying to think, where I am right now, there is one house down the hill from me that basically, unfortunately, there was a bit of a substance abuse and domestic situation going on, and we could hear them shouting at each other. That's a hell of a measurement to use. But, going farther up the hill, it's farther away that, if somebody's yelling, I can't hear it. But at the same time, we knew the names of everybody there, the names of people at both of these houses, and we knew a little bit of details about them. We didn't have them over every week for dinner or something. But generally speaking, at least a few of the details about your neighbors. But excuse me, it's, they're as close as you want them to be.
So therapists, right? So Harriet and I are therapists. We're a fan of the talking cure, as it's called. I would imagine in this kind of, in these regions, there are probably very few therapists or no therapists. I wonder if people would be even interested in going to talk to therapists. When I hear about the situation you just described, where I live, if somebody knew about there being a lot of substance abuse and maybe domestic violence down the street, I mean, somebody might call the cops. That might be their, that's not usually my thing, but might call the cops, might be an intervention, and somebody might be referred to a drug and alcohol counselor, an AA group. A guy might have to do some anger management or something if he's, presuming that's the gender setup, that's like man is being like a drunk, abusive asshole kind of guy. Or, maybe the woman will be asked, say there's counseling at this domestic violence nonprofit or something like that, or there's a shelter for her if it's like really bad, right? So that's what I'm really used to. And even in my training program, like these things would be talked about as a matter of fact, like just assuming that all these resources are there in a community, right? So it's like what you're describing to me is almost this whole other world where none of those things really sound like they're in place. So your approach to intervening in these situations sounds like it'd just be very different from what myself and probably Harriet are used to.
It is. Access to things like mental health and domestic violence intervention type programs and social workers in rural Maine is just an ongoing problem that like has not been solved for any time really, but it's just an ongoing problem that we are nowhere near solving.
Well, can I ask you too? I mean, do you think it should be? Because like, to me, this is tough too. Like even in our roles, sometimes I have this ambivalence about being a therapist in that, I mean, at least in Santa Barbara, California, I can't tell you how many people like will almost brag about like, oh, well, I'm going to see my therapist or my therapist said this or something like that. And sometimes I'm just like, come on, guys, like it's a bit much. I think it's helpful. I'm a therapist and I see a therapist. Like big fan.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think those of us, maybe a city folk, assume that you just like helicopter in a whole bunch of direct service workers, whether it's therapists and social workers, or you just helicopter them in and they go and save the day or whatever. And it just doesn't sound to me like it's not what's going on. But I also wonder, like, is your vision of, if you like could wave a magic wand and make your hometown and all of Maine look how you think it should look, or if we could get a big town hall and see what the community wants, like, would they want there to be more mental health services and social workers and domestic violence shelters and AA groups and support groups? Or would they say that's a bunch of bullshit, we don't want none of that in our town? Like, what do you think?
Well, first, they wouldn't call it a bunch of bullshit. They would just get, it would raise a lot of hackles because it would mean higher property taxes.
Oh.
And that goes into a bigger structural issue of when you fund your municipal budgets through something as inherently regressive as a property tax, it gets harder and harder every year. Again, especially in a rural depopulating area, to make an argument for more social services. So, yeah, that broader political issue aside, I think the thing I was trying to get at was there is kind of an, I guess you could say, informal social safety net around a lot of the issues that, mental health problems can exacerbate or sort of domestic issues can cause, where, if, say, you have some people struggling for food, come by the farmer's market. We've always got like a couple of vegetables left over that we give away for free, for example, because people just don't want to take home the stuff that they've consigned. They just want to get rid of their bunches of Swiss chard that they, grew too much of. Or sometimes, like, some extremely generous people will have a futon set up if they need to get out of the house and just spend a night there. But, depending on how bad the issues are with different people, they can fall through that informal social safety net, which, again, is dependent on their connections to other people in the community, which, if they're really struggling, probably weren't all that strong to begin with. And then, for example, I don't believe there's a homeless shelter anywhere in this entire county. I could be wrong. But, I remember being, for example, on a meeting at my DSA chapter, and their discussions about, like, how do we stop the police from harassing homeless people were just, like, completely unrelated to the different problems of social services and homelessness that exist out here in rural Maine. Because generally speaking, our homeless people, if they can't like find somebody else to live with around here, they go to the cities because that's where the services are. Let's see, if I could wave a magic wand at the state level, I would dramatically expand the programs that we have through Maine Care, which is our state Medicaid program.
Mm-hmm. Well, would people look for therapy? Is that a concept that is embraced? The idea of mental health and therapy as a way to achieve it, or 12-step programs as a way to achieve it, or is it not a consideration within the other pressing considerations of life?
I'd say it's a consideration, not like in the way that Max was talking about where people brag about going to their therapist in Santa Barbara, but just to the extent that people aren't, in denial, which is a part of their own problem. Like I've met many alcoholics who are just so deep in denial about like the toll that their problem is having on themselves and the people close to them. Like they're not going to darken the door of an AA meeting anytime soon. But I do think that like just generally on average, therapy probably is an option. There is just generally an access problem, which is caused by broader political and economic, which is, exacerbated by other political and economic factors.
Yeah, because now a lot of therapy is remote. It's on Skype, it's on Zoom, it's on the phone, it's on Google Chats. But if it's not conceived of as a help in life and as a need, then there wouldn't be the pressure to try to access it.
Right, and that brings up another access problem as well, which is like rural broadband is a major concern out here in the state, in my opinion, is not moving fast enough to connect people with the high-speed internet that they need. And B, if we're talking about, a population that's generally older and sometimes tends to struggle more with technology, that can be an extra barrier to people seeking the services they need.
Yes, it could. They would need help. They would, if it weren't for profit, the internet providers weren't having to make a profit, they could be there in every town, of course, because it's a service that connects people, and that's vital, particularly in this day and age. However, if you have to make money off of everything, then those places that have a sparser population, where there'll be less profitable sales, would be sadly neglected. It's the logic of capitalism and connection.
Yep. And so a lot of discussions about rural broadband buildups get stuck in this public-private partnership model where you have some of the telecom companies paying for some of the cost, but then we ask for, significant amounts from our state and municipal governments. And, when you've got a town like Carthage just south of me, which is, I think, the poorest town in the entire county, and you've got, this, I don't want to rag on him too much, but this, professional managerial class guy coming in and speaking to the Board of Selectmen saying, hey, we need $1.5 million in order to build out high-speed internet. That's just a non-starter.
Yes. So. Yes, and it really has to be a program. Since Maine has a lot of rural people, it would have to be a political demand, which would not be met by a governor like LePage was, or someone like Susan Collins. It would have to be a progressive person who wasn't moored to the capitalist system and could see, okay, tax the rich and provide this.
Yep, and Maine tends to be a lot more middle of the road than most other New England states, and we do see the consequences of that. By the way, for I guess for the folks, I don't know, is Paul LePage a prominent enough figure recently enough that we don't need to talk about him? Or
I don't know. He's prominent to me because of my colleagues at the universities that he's decimated.
Right. Yep. So for the listeners who don't know, Paul LePage was our governor from 2010 to 2018, and he was like the early prototype of Donald Trump. I don't think he said things that were as sexist as stuff that Donald Trump has said, but he has said some things that were as racist as Donald Trump did, and certainly as classist.
Yes.
Yeah, if you type Paul LePage voicemail, content warning, homophobic slurs, but it's quite impressive, the voicemail he left on one of our representatives' voicemails. But yeah, after Paul LePage was out, we got Janet Mills, who honestly is a lot closer to Susan Collins than somebody like Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
She basically shut down any effort, for example, to add dental coverage to Maine Medicaid. But, speaking as somebody who's been in and out of Maine politics since 2004, I will say that generally speaking, the politicians who end up in our state legislature are significantly farther left than they were 15 years ago. Well, so there is some hope.
Well, that's good.
I can say that.
Because Maine...
And, we have...
Maine
right,
is...
and, we have...
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was thinking it's known for their hostility towards higher education, and I hope that that's changing. Trump is not exactly a friend of that either. Wharton is now possibly rescinding his degree since it seems that he cheated on his SATs.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I mean, when I was a student at UMaine Orono, which is the flagship state university campus, there were significant cuts to the different degree programs shortly after I graduated. Like a lot of the foreign language programs, for example, got hit. I mean, it could start to make a comeback in the next couple of years. It all really depends on what kind of legislature we're looking at, because they can, have a big impact on our state university's budget.
Well, let me ask you. So in our, let's see, was it 2 episodes? Yeah, 2 episodes ago when we talked about racism, and the smaller we did like macro and micro, like systemic, institutional, down to like microaggressions and stuff. Kind of want to ask you about because I don't think this is talked about a whole lot, but like stereotypes about like rural people, which maybe not be separate from race. I'm not quite sure, but like hicks, right? Like I remember, so me growing up, I remember, so I grew up in the Bay Area, pretty leftist, but there's a lot of sort of snooty liberalism in the Bay Area for sure. So you'd hear like those dumb hicks, those backwards country people, they're all a bunch of racists. They all have like one tooth and like, and then, I think when Hillary Clinton was running, although the characterization of the deplorables wasn't supposed to be about that, it was supposed to be like Trump supporters in particular are like such nasty people or something, like these like Schadenfreude obsessed, just like they just want blood or something like that. They're deplorable. She also just gave off this air. And I think the Democratic Party as a whole, like big D, DNC, like, when you say like that professional managerial class sort of Democrat mentality, there's been this big critique that's emerged, especially since Bernie ran. And I think more people have been expanding their concepts around these issues. It started to come to my attention that it was like a commonplace thing where you're just supposed to make fun of people from the country and from rural America. And the Democrats could kind of get away with it because they just needed to try to get votes out of big cities in order to win, the elections that they thought mattered, to try to build the power they think they needed. So anyway, there's a sort of political apparatus around the stereotypes and the prejudices about country people. I grew up around it. I mean, I always just sort of thought it was true, like these stupid people that just like, I don't know, watch their plants grow or something like that. I don't know. I heard stuff like
watching
that.
Watching plants grow. Like who the hell does that? Sorry to cut you off. Just go ahead.
I mean, no, I like watching plants grow, frankly.
Like point zero, what you just talked about the Bay Area versus rural California and like stereotyping rural California as hicks. You just described the relationship between Portland, our largest city in Maine, and most of inland Maine, which is a huge problem in just about any left liberal organization at all. even my own DSA chapter, I hate to call you guys out, Southern Maine DSA, but frankly, I don't know how many meetings I've been to where I just walk away from it asking myself, do these people know there's a north of Portland? The Portland area just tends to like have so much of the population density that they tend to suck their air out of the room. And yeah, like I said, that's DSA, that's Democrats, that's even permaculture groups. And so, yeah, that's point number one, point zero. Point one, I don't know if there's like a possibility to put links to the articles I sent in the description, but if people are more interested in this, I would highly recommend the Maine Public article, Why is Maine So White, and what it means to ask that question, because it's an excellent overview of race and race relations in Maine, covering some things that I think even most Mainers don't know about in some cases. With respect to race, it's a very weird type of situation in a town, first in a state that's 95% white, and to the extent that we do have ethnic diversity, it's concentrated in the cities. For example, there's a Somali community in Lewiston, which is about an hour and a half away from me. So that the average racist today does not, mouth off, the N-word every other sentence. They will generally be sort of nice people around you. And by the way, I'm white, so I can't actually speak to the lived experience of people of color here, but I can, speak on this a little bit, I think. Your average racist is not going to mouth off this stuff all the time. There are some people who will, fly the Confederate flag on their front lawn, but they tend to be outliers. So you don't really know necessarily what people's views on race are, unless something like the widespread Black Lives Matter protests that have happened in the past month happen. It's kind of like, I think if a person of color sneezes in the woods and the racist isn't around to hear it, you're not going to hear them drop a racial slur, is the kind of how it works. But when, after the George Floyd murder and all of these Black Lives Matter protests sprung up, if you had told me there would be a Black Lives Matter protest in Portland, I would have not been surprised at all. If you had told me it was going to happen in Farmington, I would have thought you were pulling my leg. But if the more I would think about it, it wouldn't have been too much of a surprise because, for example, there is a state university campus out there with a lot of younger people, generally more ethnic, more racially diverse. If you had told me it would have happened in Kingfield, which is a town like 20 minutes away from me and has a population just under 1,000, I would have thought you were high. But that's something that happened on June 3rd, and I attended it. So it is absolutely a stereotype. It is absolutely not all MAGA hats and Klan hoods out here. Generally speaking, it's very hard to tell if someone really is a racist. I mean, you'll hear rumors, like somebody will tell you, oh yeah, so-and-so gets drunk on the weekends and blames black people for all the problems in the world. But if you're not there drinking with them on Saturday night, you don't know.
Right.
But, it is a stereotype that they're all racist, and there are plenty of anti-racist people out here.
I kind of wonder, just to piggyback on that momentarily, like when we talk about mental health being connection and a sense of hope and you're connected to people on an intimate, romantic level, on like your sort of tribe, right? Like, and we didn't talk about churches, but there's churches, there's, like you said, knitting groups, anything like that. I do wonder if like more, well, maybe this is me assuming the stereotype has some truth, but like if you do have the, like, I don't know, the drunk guy that's like, super explicitly racist or whatever, like, is it an isolation issue? Is it a lack of connection issue? And like, he just like finds some Alex Jones and then finds some, whatever the steps you get to Richard Spencer or whatever. Cause again, like if you don't have a diverse set of neighbors and you actually don't have contact with like a diverse population of people, I could see it being a little bit easier to get sucked into that kind of mentality. I mean, you're saying like, well, that's not how everybody is here. So I mean, I don't know if I'm poking at a non-issue or not, but
yeah, I mean, I would say that like the people who spout that stuff off, or at least as I've heard spout that stuff off the most, let's just assume all of the rumors are true about everybody, which is obviously not the case, but
right.
I don't know. I honestly think it might be more the people who are more connected in the community than the people who tend to be more isolated, because I think of like who you hear the rumors are about, like of the people who you hear that stuff about them. Yeah, they do tend to be people who are active in the community. So,
well, one of the things that I think happened, which doesn't surprise me, that people from small rural communities came out for Black Lives Matter, is because I think people are understanding vaguely that our lives have not mattered, that the vast mass of people in the United States have been forgotten, that the 1% has thrived and the 99% have languished, and that Black people used to be the safety valve, that were the ones fired so people could be distance. It's them. Now it's everyone. And I think people now feel we're all Black now, and therefore identify, because the vast mass of Americans feel we can't breathe. And therefore, and the idea that rural communities should not be connected because somebody has to make so much money off of it is obscene. And I think were there a strong socialist voice, that could be understood and embraced, like Lee Carter has in West Virginia, who's an outright socialist and keeps getting reelected.
Yup. Or Rick Burns, who I don't think he openly called himself a socialist, but he was a 2-term state representative in southern Maine, who I used to work for and learned a lot of my political skills under.
Yes.
So this also plays into another matter of like how the right plays into those exact trends that you talked about. Because of course Fox News will, make this into, Black Lives Matter is a bunch of rioters and Marxists who are going to come into your small Maine town and apparently riot somehow.
And loot everything.
I don't know how many. Right.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times I have heard that in Facebook comments on community pages and stuff out here. And there's one of my favorite Martin Luther King speeches is this thing that was referenced in the White Poverty Exists Ignored article, where he was talking about the creation of Jim Crow and how, the owners of the mills, when they created the sharecropping system, they were able to pay the white man terrible wages, but just with the threat of, I can hire a Black guy who will work for half your wage. And yeah, the Southern aristocracy gave the white man a psychological crow that saved him from oblivion, that no matter how far down he was still better than the Black man.
Yes, but one of the things that people are understanding as now about, at least 42 and probably more millions of Americans are unemployed, is it isn't just them. And so I think that's changing. And one of the things we ought to remember is that in the rural South, as covered, I think it's by Adolph Reed in a wonderful book called Hammer and Hoe, the Communist Party organized very powerful united tenant farmer rebellions of white and Black tenant farmers together. And that was in the 1930s. And that was possible because they both had the same ideology. And I think the fact that so many white people in rural communities, because right now I'm in a rural community and there have been, there were about 100 people in the Black Lives Matter march with people carrying signs and wearing masks out of a town of about 4,000 people, that people understand that we're in it together on some level, although we don't have the class consciousness or the class-based movement to help us unite yet. And I think we're en route. I think we're en route, which would make a big difference to isolated rural communities who deserve social services. and can't get them because they don't have enough money to give over to corporations.
Right. I agree with just about every single thing you just said. I just think that I am not entirely convinced about which narrative is going to win the day on this, because, like, on the one hand, there's, the exact quote that I dropped at the exact thing that I said at the first Black Lives Matter protest in Farmington at the beginning of June, and I got like spontaneous applause from a crowd of 100, 150 people from this, when I said that I am sick and tired of rich white people pitting poor white people against people of color to keep everybody down.
Yes.
And on the other hand, I can go onto Facebook and see a bunch of comments of people saying, "Oh, I don't have white privilege. I had to work since I was 15." And like, I say this in this condescending tone, but it is absolutely true that these people have struggled for so long and so hard in their lives, they can't even begin to wrap their heads around the idea that they have any kind of privilege in society. And that's totally understandable. And Fox News exploits that.
Yes, they do.
So,
because also just interrogating your white privilege doesn't change it. It's one of the things that Martin Luther King said is unions are the best anti-poverty program, and that it's labor unionism united that will change that. And he started the Poor People's Campaign, not the Poor Black People's Campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, because the majority of Americans who are poor are white. And I think we have to not let them once again cast what is a class struggle and a class war against the mass of American people as a race war. Because we have to remember, I'm fond of saying this because it blew my mind. Germany, a capitalist economy, started out with the COVID epidemic with a 5% unemployment rate, and they now have a 6% unemployment rate. And anyone unemployed by COVID gets between 70 and 90% of his or her salary. We started out with 4.4% unemployment and are now up to about 17% unemployment. And the reason Europe isn't in that way is the communist and socialist and green parties won't allow it. They couldn't dare try it. And so Americans aren't getting enough of that message, the class unity message, and are seeing things cast in the light of race, which is one aspect, but not the totality by a long, long shot.
Yep, that's absolutely right.
I think this would be a good place to kind of round up our discussion to say that rural Maine is suffering without the services to even conceive of the demand that they need to make for services, and that's so of rural America, which is painfully neglected by our capitalist organization of things.
Yeah, capitalism is simply not working for rural America anymore.
Right.
It's absolutely true.
Not that it works for urban America either, but
True.
It certainly isn't working for rural America. I think that's a good way to end this segment.
Yeah.
And I still have so many questions for you, but we do have to go. We're a bit over the hour. Because this has made me just start thinking. This is a different world for me, thinking about rural communities. So I'm going to keep kind of processing this. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Pete.
Thank you.
And
if there's like just one thing, because I've seen like in some of the past episodes, at least, you guys kind of sort of came around back to like. What you should do at the end of this, things like join your DSA or your IWW.
Right.
And so like, I want to urge your listeners, if you get absolutely nothing else from this podcast episode, please get this. If you are in any kind of liberal or left group in your organizing, please, please, please do not leave the countryside out of your discussions, because we are where you get your food from. It's not all MAGA hats. It's not all Klans people out here. There are absolutely people who are on your side out here. We know your opposition better than you do because we have to live with them every day.
Mm-hmm.
We know how they tick. And, ContraPoints, the famous bread tuber, she said it. She hit the nail on the head when she said, if you want to persuade people, you have to meet them where they are. and we know where your opposition is.
You sure do. And
Yeah.
you are human beings, and you are Americans, and we all need each other, and we need you.
Yes, absolutely. We
That
are
was quite
all in
the-
this together.
Yes.
That was
Or
a
we
nice
will all
mic-
die separately.
Yeah, I was going to say mic drop on what you just said, Pete. That was good. I like that.
Yes.
And
Yes.
also for listeners, if you would like to contact us, you can email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com.
All right.
All done.
And and as I said at the end of the Bath Iron Works picketing, solidarity, everybody.
Yes. Solidarity, everybody. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pete. I hadn't thought about this before, and now I am thinking about it. Thanks so
Yep.
much.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah,
Sure.
thanks for a very thought-provoking discussion, Pete.
Yeah. Oh, and Harriet, you're married to Richard Wolff, is that right?
Yeah.
Could you pass on to him that like his appearances on Russia Today and stuff were like sort of the last little bit of push that I needed to take Marxism seriously?
Oh, I will. He'll be very happy. That's a very nice
Yes.
thing to say, Pete. Yes.
I just wanted to make sure I could pass that on. So yeah, thank you so much. It was an awesome podcast recording.